So welcome. Thank you everyone for being here to what promises to be a riveting evening. And indeed one where we're going to sort of stoke the fires and stir up a bit of meaningful debate. We find ourselves in the midst of a very, very powerful fourth industrial revolution. And interestingly, as a fellow futurist and speaker, it's always delightful for me to be interviewing and introducing an esteemed peer. Now, crucially tonight, we want to visit some of the most meaningful, realistic, plausible, and in some cases, imaginative solutions to some of the most pressing issues that will face us now and in the future. And certainly when it comes to our legacy, the thing that our children inherit, this is absolutely critical. So it isn't just valid for those of us sat here today, but for very, very many generations to come. Now, I'll be your moderator tonight, as is obvious. Some very quick background. I'm a futurist and a former broadcaster. I was with CNN for 6 years, and then launched my own video series on innovation, which drew a big global audience. And then LSP found me, hunted me down, and I've been working with them ever since as a speaker. Now, at the outset itself, I want to say, I wouldn't peg Andrew as just an author, although he's pegged 4 books. My gosh, do you ever sleep? No. An expert, although he is one. A fantastic global speaker with brilliant stage presence, although he is that. Now, true as all those titles might be, for me personally, I'm going to embarrass you, Andrew, greatly.
It's hard to embarrass me.
Oh, okay, I will give it a good shot. I'm not going to heckle you from here, don't worry. Andrew, to me, is one of those kind of rare breed of true thought leaders with very, very original vision. And actually, completely fearless. Fearless in his pursuit of the real story, fearless in unearthing the most fascinating solutions to very, very real issues, and actually being provocative when the need arises. We need a lot more of that. We absolutely do, to have a balanced view on the debates of today and tomorrow.
I think we can end now, right?
Thank you for coming. Now, Andrew isn't just one of the world's best-known authorities on the digital arena or the internet. But as this book shows, he's also one of the earliest to write about the dangers of the digital revolution. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read some of his former books, but they're absolutely riveting, and this one is no different. Now, Andrew is also, and I love when people say, so-and-so wears very many hats. That's a very common phrase, isn't it? But by God, you do. So he's executive director of Futurecast, a Silicon Valley innovation salon, the host of a very popular chat show on TechCrunch, and was named one of the 100 most connected men by GQ. Aha, very, very interesting. Now, this brings us to the book that we're looking to unveil today. A bit of heckling, I can see. I will handle the audience, don't worry. I'm used to that, trust me. So this brings us to what we're unveiling today, the very, very aptly titled book, given the current state of the world, political, socio-economic, and really in all aspects of our lives, and that is How to Fix the Future. Very self-explanatory in some ways, and yet incredibly complex. And I'm going to embarrass you again. Now, the book has, I quote, been hailed as the most significant work so far in an emerging body of literature in which technology's smartest thinkers are raising alarm bells about the state of the internet and laying the groundwork for how to fix it. And really, it's the second half that I believe is, of most interest to Andrew, is let's not just rant about the issues, but let's talk about how to fix the damn thing. So this book, to me, Andrew, really stands out for all the credibility amongst all the noise out there. And it's based on Andrew's own reporting across America, around the world, and talks about how we can tackle our predicaments about the digital world. Now, Andrew also focuses on what we can really do in a sustainable way, rather than a kind of sizzle and fizzle solution about this seemingly intractable solution and situation. I'm also very interested in the 5 primary tools that Andrew's book very strongly advocates and identifies in this context, and I'll quiz him on that in a second. Right, Andrew, pinning you down for a bit of a back and forth.
Good, I like
ready?
to. Right, I'm ready.
You guys ready? Brilliant. Okay, so let's kick off with getting a sense of what spurred you on. What was that kind of nudge to write the book. Has the notion behind it been simmering gently for a while, or was it that one kind of blazing seminal moment that led you to say, I've got to write this thing?
And I wrote 3 books which were critical of the internet. More and more people were writing critical books. So I figured I need to fix the future, and we need to fix the problems. I think there's a consensus about many of the problems of the digital age. The challenge of AI on jobs, inequality, it's not just technology, but technology is driving more and more inequality. Billionaires and impoverished people. What I call the surveillance capitalist model of companies like Google and Facebook, which have turned all of us as users into the products of these companies. And the cultural crisis of fake news and narcissism and addiction. And we are all very familiar with that as parents, as users of this technology. So there's a broad range of issues that I think we need to fix.
And there is no one-size-fits-all, is what you said in your preface, in fact.
Well, there's no app to fix the future. You know, you'll have technologists who will tell you, oh, blockchain fixes everything, or Bitcoin changes everything, or fintech changes everything, or AI changes everything. But actually, what changes everything is our age-old tools that we've always used: regulation, innovation, education, consumer power, and citizen engagement. Those are the tools we've always had. And the book is historical, both it's backward-looking and forward-looking. And it reminds us that we've been through this before. We went through it with the Industrial Revolution. Huge chaos, potential, disruption, social instability, revolution, sense of injustice. And many of these problems were solved. Not all of them, but many of them were. So we need to learn from the past. I think in Silicon Valley, you'll always hear this phrase, well, this is the first time this has ever happened in human history. And whenever people say that, it's because they've never read a history book. They know nothing about the past. And of course, it's never the first time that anything has happened in human history. Sure, AI may be different from any other technology, but we've always had disruptive technologies. We've always had technologies that undermine traditional economic patterns. We've always had technologies that create a tiny elite of incredibly rich people. We've always had technologies that generate alienation and a sense of powerlessness. So we need to learn from the past. So my book, whilst it focuses on the future, is also historical.
Mm-hmm. And indeed straddling those two worlds, legacy, precedent, and kind of unearthing the meaningful patterns in what has been to come, as much critical as what will come in the future.
I mean, nothing is new here. I think Silicon Valley has always got this idea that they're doing something different. But this, whether it's the Industrial Revolution or the Reformation or the Renaissance, we've been through these disruptions before. In fact, I even come up with a term to make sense of it. You've all heard of Gordon Moore's law, the law that explains the doubling of computer power every 18 months, which is the engine of the digital revolution. I come up with my own Moore's law, which is the subject, the title of the first chapter of the book, which is about Thomas More's law, Thomas More being the author of Utopia, and his focus on agency, his reminder to his audience, to his readers, that for humans to successfully shape and reinvent disruption, they need agency. They need to make their own history. And that's our challenge, particularly in an age of smart machines, where those machines are in many ways replicating much of what we do.
And indeed, digital and technology can have a unifying, catalyzing effect, but in as much as that, it can also be incredibly fragmenting and create those silos that you've spoken about. Andrew, one really critical question. So in this book, you say it's as much about solutions as it is about people. And we've all heard the phrase Internet of Things. It's been around for years now. But you talk about the Internet of People. Tell us more.
Well, I think, and maybe it's self-evident, that the great challenge, and this is actually the subtitle of the book, How to Remain Human in the Digital Age. What we got to figure out in the age of AI, in the age of smart machines, smart cars, smart homes, smart bodies, smart cities, we got to figure out what we can do that machines can't do. And that, again, is agency. It's being creative. It's being human. So being human in the digital age means doing the very thing that computers can't do. And if we don't focus on that, then we're lost.
Mm-hmm. Now, you advocate how the digital revolution is impacting the very fabric of society and culture, demolishing some of the long-standing, very human models of living, and also actually altering the business world. Can you tell me a little bit more about the prime reasons why you feel this way, particularly in the business context?
Well, you see it in every industry. I mean, Uber is, and rideshare companies are revolutionizing the car industry. Every car company now is coming out with automated cars. You see it in healthcare. Every big healthcare company is becoming a data company. You've already seen it in the media, in music, in newspapers, which has been decimated by the digital revolution. Every industry has been traumatized, undermined, and transformed by the digital revolution. It's like a sort of tsunami that swept through the entire economy, and it's only just beginning. Fintech, for example, is revolutionizing the very nature of finance, of banks. Bitcoin is obviously challenging many of the assumptions we have about traditional currencies. In my book, I have a section on Estonia and a new kind of social contract on data between government and citizens. Estonia is changing the nature of government, of responsibility, of accountability and transparency in the digital age. So every industry, Reid Hoffman, the founder, the co-founder of LinkedIn, famously said every company now is a tech company, and every industry is tech. If you're not in tech, then you fail.
Yeah, probably dead in the water, really. Andrew, you mentioned Estonia, and your book, of course, is based on a lot of global exploration. What are some of the other fascinating kind of use cases or examples in action from different regions that you might want to highlight?
Well, I've got some friends here from Singapore. The two countries which I imagine as kind of utopias are Estonia and Singapore in terms of their reforms. Singapore is pioneering a smart nation initiative. Estonia is really the pioneer of digital government. You know, Singapore is obviously slightly controversial because of the semi-democratic, semi-authoritarian nature of the government. But Estonia is a very, very important model, and it's actually inspiring a lot of local models. In the US, for example, some people say, well, does Estonia scale? We don't see a lot of impact of Estonia, for example, in Washington, D.C. or London. But I interviewed Gina Raimondo, the governor of Rhode Island, one of the smallest states in the US. She's a VC, one of the most able politicians, next generation politicians in the US. And she talks about being inspired by the Estonian model in terms of Rhode Island. So where you see scale in terms of reforms, it's very much at the local level. I think federal government, particularly in the US and the UK, is in paralysis. It's in crisis.
And Andrew, in light of the deeply unstable political climate that we find ourselves in, and of course the very controversial, chaotic, unstable, and indeed some very fascinating heads of state and presidents, shall we say, without naming names, how do you think citizens can adapt to maintaining humanity in that sort of a setup?
Well, you know, this idea of maintaining humanity is a little highfalutin. I mean, what does that mean? I think it means focusing on what we're good at, focusing on being empowered, focusing on agency, focusing on shaping the future as opposed to being shaped by the future. So obviously our politics in some ways are in crisis. I mean, I'm from the US, obviously Trump has had a massive impact as a reality television, narcissistic social media president. Both a cause, yeah, to put it kindly, as both a cause and effect of the digital revolution. But I do think that technology is inevitably shaping politics. And the challenge is politics, and this is true across the board, the challenge is politics keeping up. Politics is one of the most, is one of the slowest, the most reactionary spaces. So what we need to find are maybe the Estonian model or people like Gina Raimondo in the US who are innovative. You know, in the book I have an interview with Margaret Vestager, the EU Commissioner of Antitrust. For me, she's a regulator who innovates because what she's doing in her regulation, in her willingness to take on Google and the other monopolists, is to create a level playing field. So I'm not in favor of regulation in itself, but the best regulators are innovators.
Right. And what's it going to take, Andrew, to then perhaps spur on the emergence of more such progressive thinkers in the next generation? What might it take? What mechanisms might do that? I mean, you've got startup incubators, for instance, where you've got some very fascinating young minds who could be the pioneers of tomorrow, the makers of the future, as we like to call it. But how might we facilitate that better?
Well, I think there's always a lot of innovation. There's always a lot of smart young people. I think they need to be accountable. I think one of the mistakes of the digital revolution is that guys like Mark Zuckerberg, who's an incredibly able, very talented young man, obviously, very successful, he drank his own Kool-Aid. He believed in the rhetoric of his own revolution. And so he's never been able to really separate himself from that Kool-Aid. I think the next generation of innovators need to be more accountable, need to understand that the digital revolution, whilst it's been very successful in many ways and changed the world, has also had a lot of very detrimental consequences. I mean, particularly in terms of fake news and narcissism and technological addiction. So what we need is a new generation, and I talk about this in the book in some detail, a new generation of entrepreneurs who are more morally accountable. They still need to be entrepreneurs. They still need to be in the business of making money. But at the same time, they need to recognize that if they break something, they fix it.
And so balancing profit with purpose for the capital.
Exactly. And we're seeing that in capitalism. We're seeing it with Unilever. I mean, the head of marketing at Unilever recently came out and said they're not advertising anymore on Google and YouTube because these are corrosive platforms. So we need people to speak out. I mean, Unilever is one of the major buyers of media because they're the largest packaged goods company in the world. So we need people to be brave, to step forward, and to be accountable for their actions.
Yeah, I love that. That's a bit of a rallying cry. Be brave and come forth.
And be accountable and take risks. But risks which aren't just sort of fetishizing risk, but risks which actually benefit the world. So, the willingness of Unilever, for example, to call out some of these platforms and say that the consequences of advertising on them is corrosive to our culture, I think is really admirable. And they're not just saying it, they're actually doing it. And this is a major company with a lot on the line.
And indeed, the impact here of the digital revolution is across both, not only the developed nations, but very much developing nations as well. Now, Andrew, talk to me about the 5 kind of prime tools that you propose in your book.
Prime tools are, as I said, regulation, innovation, consumer engagement, consumers driving the development of product, citizenship and education, and they're all important, and they all work together. Those tools are like a stack, a technology stack, and they kind of, they intersect. They're not always separate, and the same kind of technology stack that drives new technologies. I think the important thing to remember is that all these tools have been tried and tested before. It comes back to Moore's Law in Moore's Utopia, which is a 16th century book. He has arguments about regulation and innovation and the role of consumers and education, particularly education. So none of this stuff is new, and I think we need to remind ourselves of that.
Yeah. And Andrew, both you and I presumably meet both established thought leaders as well as sort of the next wave of pioneers. And indeed in Silicon Valley, you'll know better than I do, has this wonderful kind of attitude and culture of celebrating failure. Something we don't do that well, if I may say so myself, in the UK. So it's kind of fail fast, fail early, fail often. And talk about it. How can we do more of that here?
Well, I have to admit, I'm a prime example of someone who's failed up. Everything I've done has been a failure, and I seem to survive and get up on the stage. I don't think it's bad, again, as long as people are realistic about it. So when you have someone like Tim O'Reilly, who now has become a friend of mine, but when you have someone like Tim O'Reilly boasting about his failure, when he's a multi-millionaire, perhaps a billionaire, I think there is a need for some sort of humility and context. Real failure is painful. When you fail and you lose your job, when you fail and you lose your home, when you fail and you lose your family, when you fail and you become homeless, which is unfortunately increasingly the reality in America, that's not an attractive side of failure. So what we need, and I've been writing about this in lots of ways over the, in all my books, but particularly in this last book, is we need some humility in Silicon Valley. It's all very well to drink your own Kool-Aid, but the fetishization of failure is absurd when it comes to billionaires boasting about their failure when San Francisco, for example, is full of homeless people who are true failures and they don't boast about it.
And it feels more palatable when you've actually got fledgling startup founders who then, for example, it's an event called FailCon in the US.
Yeah. I wrote about FailCon in my last book.
Right. And that's kind of more what we were talking about. Now, when it comes to our collective futures, and I touched upon this earlier on, many of us are concerned about what it will mean for future generations and for our children. What sort of skills and mindsets do you think they'd need to be armed with most in order to navigate, let's say, the world in 2050?
Well, let me say firstly that I think the so-called digital natives get a very bad rap, a very bad press. Often people bash them as the I generation, as the people addicted to their iPhones and Snapchat and Facebook. But I actually think the solution to a lot of these issues will come from this generation. They're the ones who are rediscovering analog. They're the ones who are embracing vinyl. They're the ones who are paying for their online content. They're the ones who have, again, re-embraced handwriting. So I do think we need to avoid stereotyping digital natives. They're not as digital as we like to think, or my generation idealized them as digital. They're actually more analog. In terms of education, and I have a section on this in the book, I think they need to develop the, if you like, the muscle of agency. I have a section in the book on a Waldorf school, which actually my daughter goes to. And what the lead teacher there told me is that they're trying to develop the muscle of creativity, of agency. And that's very different from industrial schools. It's very different from learning digital, learning programming. Some schools are focused on programming, on acquiring computer skills, which I'm not sure is necessarily a bad thing. The problem, though, with AI is that mostly AI can do anything that programmers can do. What AI can't do is be empathetic. What AI can't do is have agency. What AI can't do is be creative. So those are the things that we need to focus on. That's how we need to reinvent education. It's a huge challenge, but it's working in some ways. It's no coincidence that the most fashionable school in Silicon Valley, in Mountain View, is the Waldorf School, where all the Facebook and the Google executives send their kids. And this is a school where you're not allowed to use tablets or iPhones. So, it's self-evident what's going on here. Teaching kids to use technology. Kids already know how to use technology. All you need to do is give them an iPhone, give them a computer, give them an iPad. It's fairly self-evident. Now, I'm not saying that what the Estonians are doing, for example, in terms of digital education is necessarily a bad thing, but we need to focus on the human. The great challenge of our digital age is getting us to do things that smart machines can't do. That's where there's jobs. That's where there's value, in areas like the development of empathy. So you might have an algorithm that will determine a disease and figure out what's wrong with someone. But you'll never have an algorithm that's able to sit down with someone and explain that disease, tell them what the problem is, and explain to them how they might confront it.
It's missing one vital element, isn't it?
Which is the human.
Yeah, exactly. Human consciousness and empathy, intuition, perception, something that you will still very much need humans for, and indeed perhaps AI can augment that rather than replace it. So what really is the crunch question then here, Andrew, is it's a massive challenge that. How do you preserve human values in an increasingly digital world? What is the magic answer to that?
There is no magic answer, as I said. There's no app to fix the future. The magic answer, if there is one, is agency. The magic answer is making sure that we can catch up with technology, that it doesn't master us, that we master it. And there are all sorts of ways we can do it. And my book is, I spent a year traveling around the world. I went to Estonia and Singapore and India and Germany and Brussels, the east and west coast of the US, the UK. And everywhere I found people figuring this stuff out. There are no absolute solutions, or whether it's lawyers making sure that Uber respect their drivers under the current law, whether it's musicians forcing Spotify to pay them correctly under the law, whether it's regulators like Margaret Vestager suing Google to make sure that it isn't taking advantage of its monopoly in search to control other markets, whether it's entrepreneurs in Germany creating new search engines that don't make us into the product. There's a huge amount of stuff going on. Some of it will work, some won't. I can't guarantee. I mean, someone said to me, well, aren't you pleased that you've been proved right? I've never really been proved right. In a previous book, I once, I think, suggested that Facebook would fail. So it's always hard to predict the future. And every company that I talk about in the book, well, maybe, for every 1 out of 2 companies, they'll fail. But the important thing is they're trying. The important thing is that we're seeing a challenge to dominant business models. That surveillance capitalism is a failure. We're seeing challenges, legal challenges to the sharing economy. We're seeing regulators take on these vast new monopolies which are larger than anything else we've seen before. We're seeing education initiatives, whether it's in Singapore, mixing of engineering and humanities, or whether it's Waldorf schools in California. There is no single solution, no app to fix the future, no one technology, but my book is a chronicle of that human endeavor. It reflects well on us as a species. All too often when you talk to people about Facebook or Google or Amazon, people say, well, what can we do? These companies are so large, we can't control them. But that is a kind of defeatism right from the beginning. So my book shows that there are many people around the world who are actually doing things in different ways. And we're seeing the fragmentation of digital marketplaces, the so-called splinternet. So, Singapore is different from Estonia. The European model is different from the US model. China is very different, although I'm not a great fan of the Chinese model. But we're seeing the appearance of real markets with very concrete differences, which reflect reality. The one thing I was determined to do in this book is not sit in a room and come up with theoretical solutions to the future, because anyone can do that. And they can say, blockchain will fix everything. But of course, blockchain can't fix everything. We heard the same thing about the internet 25 years ago, and that was a huge failure. So what I went out and looked at what real people are actually doing. Some of them will work, some won't. Some are more heroic and impressive than others. But I have friends in the audience who are part of the narrative. Everyone's doing their bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Very eloquently put. And how to fix the future also takes on the more controversial approaches rather than shying away from it. For me, that's a massive draw. It's a riveting read, refreshing take on something like this that you hear people waxing eloquently about in columns and in the press. And something like this really stands out to me. So I think it's time to open the floor to questions. That's usually
Tell me why I'm wrong.
my favorite part. Come on, hit us. Let's do it. Right, great.
And
Hannah, did you want to grab the mic? So I can spot 2 people already. Anyone else, do let us know.
Hello. With Facebook, I think, reporting their first sort of slowdown in growth in their most recent results, and millennials turning to handwriting, or certainly the younger amongst them, have we reached peak social media?
I think we probably have. You never hear about social media anymore. I was talking to my 20-year-old son, who's very much into clothing, and I saw an advert online for what's the, when you have that fancy fabric,
Fancy fabric.
expensive fabric. What is it? Cashmere, yeah. So I said shows how much I know about fashion. And there was an advert for a cashmere hoodie. And my son, who's incredibly, not like me, very much into fashion, I said to him, well, maybe I should get a cashmere hoodie. And he said to me, that is the worst idea since Facebook. So the kids are not on Facebook. I mean, it's the ultimate in uncoolness. Now, they may be on other social networks, but I think we have reached peak, particularly with regulation, particularly with the bad rap these companies are getting. I mean, Facebook's trying to get out of social media and become an AI company and a VR company in its acquisition of Oculus Rift. So I think we have reached, I'm not sure if now, maybe it was a year or 2 ago. I mean, I haven't seen a new social network for years.
Yeah.
What was the last one we saw? I don't know, Snap, which is also a massive failure.
do not have a question.
You don't?
I just wondered what you thought. I was very impressed with...
Renata, introduce yourself.
Oh, hello, I'm Renata. Renata.
And Renata's, much to her embarrassment, is in the book.
No, I can't tell you how honoured I am. When I first met Andrew, I basically went up to him and went, I'm a total fangirl. All of Andrew's books I've loved, and I am genuinely honoured to be featured in this book, which is a great read, by the way. But that aside, Andrew, I'm curious. I liked your description of Marguerite Vestager, where you said that she was talking about regulation, but innovative regulation. And obviously, I know you live in the US, but I wondered if you were aware of what the UK government are trying to do, in that they're trying to regulate, but it seems to me that they're pushing technology companies away whilst also pulling them in and wanting them to take the responsibility for everything. I wondered if you had any thoughts as to whether that was innovative regulation or backward-looking regulation.
Well, I think you probably know more about this than I do. What's your thoughts, Renata? It's a leading question.
You've said also, AI is not the solution, blockchain is not the solution, and I certainly feel that the UK government are looking to all of those things as solutions, looking at AI as a way of preventing hate speech or inappropriate imagery online, but not understanding that there are limitations to that. And it would be helpful to hear, particularly as this is being recorded, why you think that those things they're not solutions, and that possibly, whether you agree, they're limitations.
Well, I think that I'll talk about the positive regulation. As you say, Vestager is positive. I think the German initiative to force these platforms to become media companies and be accountable for their content is really important. I think the general data protection regulation is really important in order to empower, and you know more about this than I do, empower users to be able to carry their data around with them. Not all regulation is good. I mean, the French-Spanish initiative to force Google to pay newspapers every time you send them traffic is obviously absurd. But I think Europe is really innovating in this area and is leading the world and inspiring America. You have more and more comments now in America, firstly about the need for antitrust. You've got Ted Cruz and Steve Bannon and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. That's the unholiest of marriages. They all agree that there's a need for an antitrust, more aggressive antitrust regime, particularly in terms of Google and Amazon. And you have increasing calls for data regulation. So I think Europe is leading here. I think it's one of the illusions that America always leads. And I think one of the points of the book is that Europe is pioneering a lot of this regulation, and regulation is innovative. I mean, with Vestager, her point is that she's creating a level playing field. At the moment, with these vast platforms, it's very hard to do a startup. We're back in the 90s when Microsoft controlled everything. Imagine if there hadn't been an antitrust investigation of Microsoft in 97 and 98. Then the internet would have become just an extension of Microsoft. They would have owned search. They would have owned social media. And of course, today, the large platforms are even more powerful than Microsoft ever was. So from the point of view of startup entrepreneurs and VCs, re-decentralization is key. So some of the prominent venture capitalists I interview in the book, Brad Burnham from Union Square Ventures in New York, John Borthwick, a very dear friend of mine who runs BetaWorks in New York, they all say the same thing. Their business depends on innovation. And the dominance of these platforms is bad for business.
Go on, I know we've got some more burning questions.
Even if they're not burning.
Yeah, even if they're not burning.
My name is Dominic Cotton. I run a very small organisation that is seeking to encourage corporate organisations to take their social responsibility.
Never say your organisation is small.
We're growing. We'll be huge. That's why I'm here. I'm interested to know, you've got a chapter on, small is beautiful actually, by the way. You've got a chapter on social responsibility. I'm fascinated to know a bit more about that, having read an article in a magazine that you wrote, not your book yet.
Yeah.
What are you talking about, and how hopeful are you that businesses, perhaps not some of the ones you've referred to, but businesses generally will will take their social responsibilities more seriously?
Well, I do think we have to be careful. I mean, businesses are for-profit organizations. And I think one of the mistakes of Silicon Valley, one of the reasons they've got themselves in so much trouble in terms of their perception, is because they believed their own hype. They drank their own Kool-Aid. So Zuckerberg believed that he could both become incredibly rich and powerful and good at the same time. Google peddled the idea of do no evil. The reality of these companies is they're neither better nor worse than big banks, big pharma, or any other big company. But what I do talk about in the book is the need for these, especially these multi-billionaires, to become more accountable. And again, I use the historical example of people like Andrew Carnegie in the 19th century, who spent the first half of his life ripping off society and the second half giving back. Gates is a model of that. Mark Benioff of Salesforce is an example. I call on people like Zuckerberg and Bezos to do the same. It's incredibly important. I mean, Bezos is not only the richest man in the world at the moment, but the richest man in history. He put out a tweet recently asking people what he should do with his money. And in terms of his philanthropic initiatives. And my principle in the book is that the old General Colin Powell law, you break it, you fix it. So what Bezos has done more than anything else is automate the workplace, undermine retail, undermine many millions of jobs in retail. He has a responsibility to try to fix the challenge of joblessness in the age of smart machines. I think, I'm hopeful about Bezos. I think he has the moral backbone and the intellectual heft to do it. I'm less convinced of people like Zuckerberg. But I do have a chapter in the book that deals with all these people. There are still models. I mean, there's a guy called Craig Newmark. He was the founder of Craigslist. Some of you will know that. Craigslist was one of the early Web 1.0 companies. And it was a brilliant company, but disintermediated local media, enabled everyone to advertise online for free. One of the unintended consequences of Craigslist was it essentially destroyed local journalism, local papers, because it undermined their business model, because advertising was free online and local newspapers were dependent on paid advertising. He didn't mean to do that. He was a very good-natured, well-meaning person. So it's what he's done since cashing out in some ways in Craigslist is try to figure out solutions to the crisis of local media. So we need accountability. You hear of Zuckerberg giving away all his money, 99%, but then when you look a little bit more carefully, it's all a bit of a tax dodge. So we need more honesty, more upfront responsibility with these people. They can't hoodwink us anymore.
Brilliant. I think on that very powerful and compelling note, we shall call it a night so we can all get chatting. Andrew, thank you for being in my hot seat tonight.
Thank you.
And thank you all for listening.